In this series of short videos, we will be introducing you to the Military Aviation Preservation Society, or MAPS, Air Museum, and some of the aircraft and displays that are located at our facility in Greene, Ohio. We hope that these presentations enhance your appreciation of history and those that lived it. Man's fascination with flight and a desire to fly has always been with us. A quote attributed to Leonardo da Vinci gives you only one view of this obsession. It reads, "Once you have tasted flight, you will forever walk the earth with your eyes turned skyward, for there you have been, and there you will always long to return." At MAPS, the history of aviation is more than just airplanes. It is about those who have dreamed of flying, those who ultimately made those dreams a reality, and those that have experienced the freedom of flight. We hope to share that and more with you in these video presentations. We hope to cover the general background of each type of aircraft, as well as the history of the actual airframe that we have here at the museum. In some cases, we have dedicated specific aircraft to local men and women. If this is the case, we will discuss why we decided to dedicate the aircraft to them. In this video presentation, we will be introducing you to the oldest aircraft in our collection, the Martin Glider. The Glider is a unique part of the museum's collection and a milestone in Ohio aviation history, as it was designed, built, and flown by a local farmer who was one of those dreamers. This one who made his dreams a reality. At the turn of the 20th century, men throughout the world were studying the concept of a manned flying machine. When we talk about these pioneers from the state of Ohio, Wilbur and Orville Wright are the first names that come to mind. They made the first controlled, sustained flight of a powered, heavier-than-air aircraft with the Wright Flyer on December 17, 1903, near Kill Devil Hills, about 4 miles south of Kitty Hawk, North Carolina. Today, they are generally credited with inventing, building, and flying the world's first successful motor-operated airplane. What many people do not realize is that an Ohio couple just short of 200 miles to the northeast would make their own bit of history less than a decade later. On January 12, 1909, William Martin and his wife Elmina of Canton, Ohio, successfully tested an aircraft with a significantly different design. William Henry Martin was born on January 22, 1855, in Canton Township to Charles and Delilah Smith Martin. His father was a farmer who also operated a rope-making business on the side. At about 14 years of age, William started experimenting with toy planes, flying them by hand or powered with rubber bands. When he was 17, his father bought the Colbeck Farm, located north of 30th Street and east of Martindale Road, which was named for the Martin family. On October 10, 1878, Martin married Mary E. Pontius and purchased a farm near his father on Harrisburg Road. In his spare time, he studied engineering and surveying. He and Mary had 6 children together before her untimely death in September of 1893. 2 years later, Martin married Mrs. Elmina Holtz Pontius, widow of Thomas Pontius. She and Martin had 3 more children. Mr. Martin joined a debating society at Brush College near Canton. When asked to suggest a subject for debate, he proposed the topic, "Resolve that man will fly." Everyone laughed. No one else would take the affirmative position of the debate with him. Mr. Martin debated alone against 3 others arguing in the negative. He won the debate, and the study that he put into preparation for the event gave him an inspiration and a belief in the possibility of flying that lasted throughout his life. He began experimenting in the field of aeronautics around 1887 and developed a design for a monoplane, or single-winged glider, as opposed to the biplane design made famous by the Wright brothers. His experimenting reached the point that Martin submitted an application for a U.S. patent on January 3, 1908 for his model flying machine, with the assistance of local patent attorneys Henry Fries and F.W. Bond. Patent 935384 was approved on September 28, 1909. Unfortunately, he could not find a manufacturer for his creation, so the toy never went into production. On April 22, 1900, Mr. Martin appeared before the New York Aeronautics Society and demonstrated his small model, which made several flights powered by rubber bands. It is believed that this may have been the first demonstration of a practical miniature flying model, the forerunner of a sport that is still a favorite of boys, both young and old, throughout the world. His design was unique for its time, with some very unique features. Unlike many of the aviation pioneers of that time, Martin opted for a monowing design instead of the bi-wing concept used by many of the aviation pioneers of the time. One of the more unusual features of Martin's design was the inclusion of two sheets, or diagonal balancing planes, as he called them. These diagonal stabilizers extended from the lower frame of the aircraft at an upward angle and attached to each side of the single wing, forming a V. They provided not only stability, but support for the single wing to keep it rigid. The aircraft was powered by two propellers in tandem, revolving in opposite directions. His ultimate intention was to build a craft that was capable of manned-powered flight. Martin was aware of the success of the Wright Flyer and successive flights by the brothers, and understood that, without an engine, his creation would remain only a novelty. After several unsuccessful attempts at securing a lightweight and reliable motor, Martin could no longer justify the expense of outfitting his flying machine with an engine. During the winter months of 1908-1909, Martin constructed a full-scale aircraft based on the design of his model. There were a number of changes to the original patented design for the full-scale aircraft because of the lack of an engine. A small horizontal wing, often referred to as a canard, was attached to the front of the framework and controlled by a stick located to the right of the pilot's seat. The stick, connected to the canard wing by two wires, would control pitch or up and down motion. At the rear of the aircraft, inside a redesigned tail structure, was a movable vertical tail fin which could control yaw or left and right motion. The rudder was connected by two wires to a horizontal bar located in front of the pilot's seat. By placing one foot on either end of the bar, the pilot could change the angle of the rudder by pressing one foot or the other. The aircraft structure was made of light wood and had English broadcloth stretched over the wing surface, which were sewn by Mrs. Martin. The structure was supported by interconnecting wires. When it was ready for testing in January of 1909, snow caused him to add sled runners instead of wheels so it could be tested in the snow. He later added wheels for warm weather flights. William and his sons George, Thoburn, and Charles hauled the machine from the barn to the top of a hill on the back section of the family farm on January 12, 1909. William climbed into his creation and waited as Billy, The family's farm horse was hitched to the front of the plane by a long rope. When all was set, George whistled to Billy, and the horse started down the hill at a fast clip. The aircraft's runners glided through the snow for a short distance until the craft lifted from the ground and gained an altitude of about 20 feet. As Billy slowed, the plane settled back to the ground. The first flight lasted about 200 feet. Martin's grandson, William H. Martin II, later joked that his grandfather had invented the first one-horsepower airplane. Mrs. Martin then took her seat in the aircraft and made several successful flights, being the first American woman to fly a heavier-than-air craft. Her flight traveled 300 feet and reached an altitude of 35 feet. Mr. Martin's experiments had been kept a secret, but the trial flights could not be hidden. Neighbors flocked to the field to see for the first time in their lives a human being sustained in the air by a heavier-than-air machine. A photographer came to the farm to take pictures of the flights, but became so excited that he failed to operate his camera correctly, and all of the photographic plates were ruined. For that reason, there is no photographic record of the first flights of the Martin glider. Over the next few weeks, the aircraft made more than 100 flights. Flights were halted for a period when one of the sled runners hit a bare patch of ground, swerving the plane against a fence. One of the wings was damaged, so flights were suspended while repairs were made. As Martin's popularity grew, he nurtured friendships with the era's aviation idols, such as the Wright brothers and Charles Lindbergh. Martin had his eye on more than just the local scene and wanted to get his plane demonstrated to a wider audience. He was hampered again by lack of funds for such a venture. William A. Herbertier, who with his brother L. A. Herbertier operated Lyric Amusement Company of Canton, helped finance the trips to New York. In May of 1909, Mr. Martin returned to New York, this time with Mrs. Martin. They demonstrated their plane successfully at the Hudson Fulton celebration, which sponsored an air meet at Morris Park, New York, under the umbrella of the New York Aeronautics Society. By this time, the ski runners had been replaced by 3 small wheels. During the exhibition, the aircraft was powered by an automobile donated by Henry Ford and driven by Oral A. Parker, a director and legal counsel for the society. The picture shows Mr. Parker driving the car with Mr. and Mrs. Martin as passengers. The pilot for this flight was former jockey George Thompson. During the Morris Park exhibition, however, an incident occurred that might have been fatal to the inventor. As Mr. Martin described it, quote, "The wind was high that day, so I would not allow my wife to fly. Other men who were scheduled to perform refused to go up. I finally agreed to fly myself. The plane swept along like a bird until we reached the end of one of the grandstands, when a terrific burst of wind struck it. Had the rope held, I would have been safe, for my machine was so constructed that it cannot nosedive, but the rope broke and we started down. I had 2 chances, either to land on the fence or glide the machine through the rails, which were fairly wide apart. I chose the latter. For a moment it seemed we would be dashed to pieces, but my plane responded to my efforts to guide it, and we crashed through the opening and stopped. I escaped without a scratch." Back in Canton that fall, another milestone was established. On September 21, 1909, Mr. Martin's 8-year-old granddaughter, Blanche Martin, made several solo flights in the machine. Her flights were about 75 feet in length. It was the first time a child of such age had ever taken to the air in a heavier-than-air machine. This was also one of the last recorded flights. Nearly 20 years passed. In 1909, his glider had been a first in the field of aviation and had brought with it fame and recognition. By the late 1920s, it had been bypassed by better-funded projects that soared even higher. The glider was packed away in the barn and all but forgotten as Martin turned his focus to other things. In 1928, Ohio Representative John McSweeney heard about the glider and came to see it. He reported his findings to the curator at the Smithsonian Institute in Washington. 20 years after the plane was built, patented, and successfully flown, Mr. Martin offered it to the Smithsonian. After long and careful investigation, the Smithsonian Institute accepted it as being the first airplane of its type, and on January 19, 1929, the Martin glider arrived in Washington. The Smithsonian Institute put it on display next to Charles Lindbergh's Spirit of St. Louis. William Martin died in March of 1937 at the home he had lived in for 44 years. When he died, his funeral had to be postponed, as international travelers wished to pay their respects to this gentleman who had the courage to stay with his conviction, resolved that man will fly, as indeed he did. When Harry Rinkert organized the Canton Aviation Company in 1938 and acquired the land for the airport, he named it Martin Field, in honor of William Martin, whose farm then adjoined the field. Decades passed. History and the world of aviation seemingly had forgotten about Martin and his glider. However, in 1971, the Stark County Historical Society, now the William McKinley Presidential Library and Museum, initiated inquiries to the Smithsonian with the idea of returning the glider to Canton. There was somewhat of a concern that the Smithsonian at first was unable to find any trace of the glider. Eventually, it was discovered that in 1957, the glider had been removed from the display and stored in an obscure warehouse. After several years of cutting through red tape, the glider was shipped to Canton in July of 1978 in a 2-foot by 9-foot crate. According to the director of the McKinley Museum, quote, "What we received was a box of sticks and 3 wheels. The museum staff was able to reconstruct the glider with new wire and recovered it with new artificially aged cloth substituted for the original, despite having no blueprints or assembly instructions. The reassembled Martin glider hung in the museum's science wing for many years. Plans for a new display called Discover World revamped the space occupied by the aircraft, so it was disassembled and again placed in storage." In 2002, MAPS approached the William McKinley Presidential Library and Museum about borrowing the glider for display. Starting in January of 2005, a team of MAPS volunteers, once again without blueprints or assembly instructions, reconstructed the glider, replacing parts that had deteriorated while in storage. The reconstruction process was completed in October of 2005 when the Martin glider was again placed on display. The aircraft was dedicated in a ceremony on November 12, 2005. The Martin glider hangs in a place of honor at the MAPS Air Museum, just 12 miles from where it first took to the air and suspended at the altitude achieved on its first flight. It remains to this day on loan from the William McKinley Presidential Library and Museum, a reminder of local aviation history. This aircraft represents the efforts and achievements of a resident of Canton, Ohio, and marked the beginning of a long period of aviation prominence in Stark County and Northeast Ohio.